Hello, welcome to another episode of Self-Wired. I'm going to be going over part 4 of Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. We're going to be getting into the way in which psychology and economic theory mesh together and form both a systematic way in which we can utilize psychology in the hopes of understanding economics, and the way in which psychology kind of proves to us that this is something that's almost impossible in some cases because of the irrationality of human beings. And in some interviews with Daniel Kahneman, he says he doesn't like this word irrationality, but I don't really see another way to put it, right? We have this view of human beings that they're these logical agents that are utilizing their capacity to think rationally, and that in the real world, this is something that we can rely upon in order to gauge behavior down the road. And this was a view that was commonly held for about 250 years, this view of rational agents and the way that economic theory can predict behavior, called utility theory, which was proposed by a man named Bernoulli, like I said, 250 years ago, right? And so this was this scope of human behavior, and you could make lots of predictions about it. It's still commonly held. If you take a intro to economics class, these original ideas of people as rational agents will be kind of set forward in order to be able to understand these very complicated economic theories. And what Daniel Kahneman does is he kind of pokes holes in these theories, because the more we begin to understand about human nature through these psychological studies, the more we begin to understand that in a lot of instances, humans aren't governed by rational thought, okay? We're governed by our emotions a lot of the time. This is something I've touched upon in previous videos, but something that becomes more and more apparent under the scope of economic theory, okay? So, to backtrack a little bit, Bernoulli proposed the idea that individuals typically want to avoid risk, obviously. They want to avoid the worst outcome. They want to ensure that they have a sure outcome. They don't like gambles, and they want to avoid uncertainty, okay? And a lot of this is true. But the problem with Bernoulli's theory is that it's in a lot of ways incomplete. And I'm not going to get too much into utility theory, which was this is the prevailing model for a long time until Daniel Kahneman came around 1979, and he later won the Nobel Prize in economics for what he proposed, which is now a more complete theory of psychology and the way that intermingles with economics, called prospect theory. So I'll get into prospect theory more so than Bernoulli's theory. If you want to check out more of Bernoulli's theory, there's a lot of literature on that, something that I'm not exactly interested in. I'm more interested in what Daniel Kahneman has to say about human nature rather than what Bernoulli has to say about economic theory. So the fundamental issue with utility theory proposed by Bernoulli is that it doesn't have a reference point. So this reference point is something that's you can't leave this reference point out, okay? a good example of this is, say you have two people, right? You have Jack and Jill. Jack and Jill both have $5 million, okay? Who wouldn't want $5 million? If you have $5 million, you're doing pretty well, okay? So Bernoulli thinks, like, okay, these people have $5 million. I can predict their happiness by understanding that they have $5 million. I can understand Jack and Jill are equally happy. However, what Daniel Kahneman proves is that you can't predict happiness by this mere assumption that $5 million will make you happy. And he disproves this by saying, what if yesterday Jack had $1 million and Jill had 9? Okay? So if you woke up one morning and you lost $4 million, you're going to be horrified. You're not going to be happy whatsoever. Even though you have this $5 million, chances are you're going to be pretty bummed out. However, if you gained $4 million, hey, like you're doing good. The day has started off in a great way. How come these two people are at different states of happiness? Well, it's because of this thing called a reference point. And this reference point is how we estimate something called loss aversion, right? So you have to have a starting point, a reference point to understand where you're at in terms of a gain or a loss. And something that's intuitively obvious to everyone is you want to seek wins and you want to avoid losses. Moreover, losses impact you on an emotional level more so than gains do. And a good way to understand this is by looking at golf statistics, right? So you can think of the reference point in golf as a par, okay? So it's kind of like the average of how well you want to do, right? And a birdie is one score down from that, right? So you had a stroke over par, meaning you did worse than par. And when you're looking at these golf statistics, a lot of the time what you see is golfers will putt better when they're aiming for that par than they will when they're aiming for that birdie. They'll hit their goal better than they will achieve above their goal. So this is interesting, because why wouldn't you want to achieve better than a goal, better than your goal, right? Why wouldn't you want to do better than you expected? That's just not necessarily the way that humans have evolved, right? We're designed to be avoidant of these possible failures, right? Losses loom larger in our psychology than gains do. And that's because there's a lot of dangerous things in the world, right? We don't want to be searching out the best outcome. We want to be striving to avoid the worst outcome. Then there's a lot of, if you look at evolutionary psychology, there's a lot of backing to this idea, because surviving an attack from a tiger might be better than getting food, right? You can survive a few days without food, but you're not going to survive an encounter with an angry tiger, right? You want to avoid being prey rather than being a predator in a lot of circumstances. That's kind of a simple notion of this, but that's not necessarily the focal point of this chapter. I don't want to get too far into this idea of evolution and the way that intermingles with psychology. This is more this part rather than chapter has to do more with economics. And so the thing that we can take from this evolution idea is the idea that bad events loom larger than good events. Okay, there's a pretty funny idea listed in this chapter that I'm speaking on currently, which is one cockroach can ruin a bowl of cherries, but one cherry does very little for a bowl of cockroaches, right? So getting into this idea of a reference point and how that applies to economics as a whole, right? So a lot of the time in normal economic theory, before it understands what psychology has to offer, is that fairness doesn't necessarily matter. And this is something that Kahneman kind of disposes of in one of his studies. So this idea that fairness doesn't matter is disproven when you look at what people deem to be fair and unfair in terms of the way in which a company is run. Okay, so if you have a shovel that's $15 and then one day it snows and that shovel's now $20, most people would say that's unfair, right? You're taking advantage of a need, right? And in typical economic theory, you think of it like, okay, it's just supply and demand. That's fair. People won't retaliate against that. But what you fail to understand is that people are motivated by altruistic punishment a lot of the time. And so this altruistic punishment is very common. Someone might retaliate by taking their business elsewhere because of this initial reference point of $15. They feel taken advantage of. They feel as though they have lost $5, and their emotions inside of them force them to go, okay, this person's taking advantage of me. I've just experienced a loss due to this person. I'll retaliate in any way I know how, right? So that's essentially a reference point. That's essentially how psychology intermingles with economics. The idea of prospect theory being this thing that takes into account the reference point as well as many other things in terms of explaining the irrational aspect of attempting to predict behavior. So the next thing I'm going to be getting into is uncertainty and certainty, as well as overestimating something called the possibility effect, where essentially we begin to understand that worry is not, if you're worried about something, if you're afraid of something, expecting to experience a loss, that emotion of worry and fear isn't necessarily proportionate to the probability of an event happening. Okay? So an example of this may be terrorism, right? So if you know there's one terrorist loose in your general area where you're going to be spending time, and another person in a different area is aware of two terrorists loose and the possibility of a terrorist attack, their worry is essentially the same, even though it's double the possibility of an attack. Okay? This idea of blanking on the name of like weight differences. This idea that the weight of your worry, your emotional response to a worry, doesn't coincide with probability. And we've discussed this in other videos where System 1 isn't necessarily good at understanding statistics. It might understand that it has a 0.0001% chance of cancer in a population, and it doesn't understand the difference between that and a 0.001. But if you look at, if you think about COVID, 1% fatality rate is equivalent to millions of deaths if you extrapolate that percentage into a population. We're bad at this. We hear, a 0.01% chance of dying, and we think, okay, I'm fine. You don't understand that is a substantial amount when it's applied to a larger population. We're bad at understanding rare events, both when the rare event is possible or impossible, okay, if that makes any amount of sense. Maybe not a rare event, but event in and of itself might be possible or impossible. We're bad at understanding the probability of that, right? And an aspect of this is an availability heuristic, right? So going back to the example of terrorism, if we're seeing countless examples of terrorism on the news, we can quickly draw this idea of terrorism to mind, and we begin thinking that terrorism is this thing that's prevailing everywhere. We're definitely going to be terrorized. We're definitely going to be part of a terrorist attack because we can so quickly draw this to mind. If you remember the last video regarding sex scandals, that's something that tabloids love. So we have this inexact view of sex scandals in political or in the political realm or the realm of actors, right? We can draw it to mind easily. Okay. The last thing I'm gonna touch on is this idea of a sunk cost fallacy, and this is this problem of, again, going back to wins versus losses, right? When we see the world, we don't necessarily see it the way that Bernoulli sees it, which is utility, right? This idea of having $5 million has the same utility to two different people. The reference point matters, okay? In the same way, wins and losses matter to us. Again, we're loss averse. So the CEO of a company, for example, might bank millions of dollars into a project that he or she has already started because they have this aversion to having a loss on their record. That's a terrifying idea. It's like, I screwed up this project. I can't go on to the next project because that means I lost, right? They can't give up because that giving up is a loss. So they'll pour more and more money into the same project, even though they could possibly lose anyway, as opposed to pouring the same amount of money into a different project, right? We have this incapacity to have an outside view from the last part, where we would be able to see objectively, I could pour the same amount of money into a different project and come away. But no, we're too loss averse to do that. That's an irrational way of thinking. That's the system one coming in and not being able to look at probabilities, not being able to look at an outsider's viewpoint who doesn't have this emotional attachment to this project, okay? So another example is, another key aspect of this part that I want to touch on is this idea of broad framing. So an easy example to use in terms of this is, excuse me for 1 second. This idea of having two different categories of an instance taken separately, they would give a different instance, right? So an example of this would be in a jury, right? You have a child who was playing with matches and they have these pajamas on, and these pajamas happen to not be as fire resistant as they should be, right? So the child drops the match and experiences severe burns. That's one example of a trial that has gone on in a jury. Another example is a bank that experienced a huge loss because someone from a business interaction that they were having was screwed up in some kind of business dealing. They lost a ton of money, okay? So taken separately, someone might look at the bank example and give an estimate of the amount of money that should be given back to that bank because it was this other person's fault, right? And the jury would come to that conclusion. They might look at the example of the child being burned and give less money. But when compared together, the child gets more money because we have this idea of, well, the health of a child matters more than business interactions. Separately, the bank gets more money and the child gets less. Together, we see the child getting more and the bank getting less. And this is a complicated problem that psychology can help illuminate a little bit. We see these different categories in terms of what we give more credence to in terms of what matters most, which is human safety and a human's health matters more than a business interaction. However, we won't necessarily be completely objective about it because we're bad at using this system too, right? And when they're given together, we can't accept the fact that this business interaction will get more money than this injured child. It's just the numbers don't add up when viewed separately, but when viewed together, this problem of emotion comes in. And the problem changes drastically because of it. Another example would be if you look at the idea of like worker safety, that the compensation for an injured worker caps at $7,000 in some instances. However, like a fine for injuring a bird in a different circumstance caps at $25,000. So taken separately, you understand we got to the number for humans at 7,000 because it was cut off from this other endeavor of setting a price for setting a fine for injuring wild birds. They're two separate things, but taken together, you look at it and go, hold on, why are birds more important than humans? And it's this idea of kind of a categorical error where taken separately, they're different categories. We come to different conclusions by looking at them separately. Taken together, we understand that this doesn't add up in a rational way, right? So I know that those were kind of different ideas, and that wasn't necessarily a very smooth segue. I was trying to quickly touch on the main aspects, the key takeaways from this part, and just to reiterate that, understanding the irrationality, quote, irrationality, that might not be the best way to put it, but the irrationality of economic theory and the way that humans actually interact in terms of loss aversion, the sunk cost fallacy, the incongruities and categorical errors, and the problems that arise when we're unable to look at and successfully weigh the probabilities of events. So I hope that was somewhat illuminating in terms of what Daniel Kahneman has to say, both about System 1 and System 2, the two selves that come into play when we're making decisions and predicting behavior, as well as some of the applications in terms of economics and the way that psychology can help illuminate human behavior in the workplace and in the stock market, and in all of these different realms. We can begin to understand how our emotions begin to interact with our emotions typically come into play more so than a rational, systematic, and statistical viewpoint of the world, an outside view, an objective version of reality. So thanks for listening, and I will see you next week with the final aspect of this book.